Have you ever wondered why African leaders were involved in the slave trade? It's a question often oversimplified with misleading answers. Many believe African leaders willingly and greedily participated in this inhumane trade. But is it the entire truth? Could they have been victims of circumstances coerced into this dark path? Let's unravel the layers of misconception and introduce the concept of compulsion that led these leaders to make such devastating decisions. It's time to delve deep into the untold stories of African history and slavery. The African involvement in the slave trade didn't happen overnight. Long before the height of the transatlantic slave trade, early European explorers made contact with African leaders, exchanging goods and ideas. However, as time passed, these interactions became less friendly and more coercive. European traders began to present African leaders with a grim choice: cooperate and sell slaves, or face the potential devastation of their kingdoms. These traders often came with superior weaponry and promises of wealth and power, creating a powerful incentive for African leaders to comply. However, this decision was not made lightly. Many leaders were torn between the desire to protect their people and the need to maintain their own power. The slave trade was a complex and tragic part of history, not a simple matter of villains and victims. It was a web of difficult decisions and dire circumstances. Faced with these pressures, African leaders found themselves in a difficult position. Caught between a rock and a hard place, African leaders had to make choices. Choices that were neither easy nor devoid of consequences. Let's consider the case of King Alfonso I of Congo, who initially cooperated with the Portuguese, trading his subjects in exchange for European goods. However, as he witnessed the devastating impact of slavery on his kingdom, he dared to resist. His letters to the Portuguese king, pleading to stop the slave trade, fell on deaf ears. His resistance was met with brutal military force, plunging his kingdom into chaos and despair. On the other side of the coin, we find leaders like King Gezo of Dahomey. He realized that his kingdom's survival hinged on pleasing the European powers. So, he succumbed to the pressure, turning Dahomey into a major hub for the transatlantic slave trade. His decision was not born out of malice or greed, but a desperate bid to protect his people from the wrath of the Europeans. These leaders' decisions were not made in a vacuum. They were responses to a world that was changing rapidly, with new powers rising and old ones falling. They were trying to navigate these choppy waters, often with limited resources and information. These leaders were not simply trading their people for profit. They were often trying to survive in a rapidly changing world. The repercussions of these forced decisions still echo today. The slave trade, driven by external forces and necessitated by dire circumstances, left a lasting imprint on the African continent. The societal fabric was torn apart, with families separated and communities decimated. The economic impact was equally profound. As vast numbers of able-bodied individuals were forcibly taken away, Africa was stripped of its human capital, causing stagnation and hindering development for centuries. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the slave trade is the psychological trauma it inflicted. The collective memory of such a dark period continues to shape attitudes, perceptions, and relationships, both within Africa and between Africa and the rest of the world. The slave trade was not a choice made by African leaders, but a desperate attempt to navigate a world dominated by powerful foreign interests. The story of African leaders in the slave trade is not one of willing participation, but of survival in the face of overwhelming pressure. As we delve into history, it's essential to challenge our preconceptions. We have seen how African leaders were subjected to immense pressures, forced to make unthinkable choices in a world dominated by foreign interests. Their participation in the slave trade, while deeply regrettable, was not a simple act of greed or cruelty, but a decision made under duress, in a desperate bid to protect their people and their sovereignty. The repercussions of this painful chapter continue to echo across the African continent today, in the form of economic challenges, societal fractures, and a lingering sense of loss. These long-term effects serve as a sobering reminder of the devastating impact of foreign interference and the resilience of the African people. As we reflect on this complex narrative, let us remember that history is rarely black and white. African history is more complex than it seems, and understanding it requires us to look beyond the surface.